Ah, the 90s. Many of you watching this video think of that time as the 1900s, which to me feels like getting punched in the gut over and over by Hulk Hogan, a professional wrestler who found fame during the 1900s. But as a gamer born in the early 1980s, I really came of age during that decade of American prosperity that brought us the Animaniacs the first time around, King of the Hill the first time around, and Futurama. You get it. They reboot a lot of shows nowadays. As good as the 90s were for TV and films, though, they were even better for video games. And for JRPG fans, it was about as good as it could get. Let's talk about the 90s and about what it was like to be a JRPG player back in that golden age of gaming. All right, this is Just the Gems. I'm Brandon, and this is, I guess, what happens when I switch up my format. I forget to introduce myself and the channel. Oh well, here we go. Playing games on the original NES was pure fun. I got my NES around age 5, and I got so much enjoyment out of that thing. But when the new generation of gaming came around, I turned on the NES as quickly as Senior Chang turned on the study group. Any community fans in the audience? I know you're out there. Say hey. I needed to have 16-bit power. I was a little kid. I wasn't great at math yet. Still am not, actually. But even I knew 16 bits was twice as many as 8 bits. So I sold my NES and every game I owned at a garage sale, and with my spoils in hand, I purchased a Super NES. My first forays into 16-bit gaming were Super Mario World, an obvious and enduring classic, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, arguably one of the greatest video games of all time, and Home Alone, a game that also was available. I didn't miss my NES one bit. These games were so cool, but something was missing. It just took me a little while to realize what it was. What it was JRPGs. I didn't know they were called that back then. Heck, I don't think the term really existed in the early 90s. They were just RPGs, or adventure games. And once they started coming to the Super NES, they didn't stop. When people in my age demographic wax poetic about this era of JRPG gaming, you have to keep in mind, we didn't have the internet with up-to-the-minute knowledge about every game about to hit store shelves. We often didn't know about a game until we saw it sitting on store shelves, and then we only had the box art to convince us to give it a chance. For me, it wasn't the box art of Final Fantasy II that convinced me to pick it up. Let's be real, the box art isn't doing the game any favors. I mean, it's tasteful, right? Nowadays, I think this cover would be considered excellent, but back then it didn't really do much, except to announce the name of the game. No, it was my memories of watching a friend play the original Final Fantasy on NES a few years prior that told me I needed to grab this one. Or more accurately, needed to convince my mom to buy it for me. Riding home, reading the manual in the backseat of the car, miraculously not getting car sick, oh to be young again. This was always the first way we experienced a game in the 90s. The manual for Final Fantasy II even had a mini walkthrough for the first section of the game, so I made sure to fully prepare myself for the adventure by spoiling the entire opening act. But spoilers weren't really a concern back then. For one thing, we didn't know how good a story in an RPG could be. In the 80s, the best RPG stories amounted to save the princess, save the world. For all we knew, that was as good as game stories could get. But the 16-bit era of JRPGs pretty quickly disabused us of that very incorrect notion. Even from the beginning, Final Fantasy II left every 8-bit JRPG story in the dust. We've gone from slaying dragons and saving princesses, to soldiers facing deep moral dilemmas about blindly following orders, characters with actual names and histories, not to mention relationships with other characters, and even, let's just say, some of the things you, the player, are asked to do in Final Fantasy II are pretty gut-wrenching, if you think about it. We were not ready for how much these stories would make us think, and nowhere near prepared for how they would make us feel. Suddenly, characters we loved could die. And not just pass out in battle to be revived by a life potion. No, they were dead. Permanently. To lose a character you've grown to love over the course of the story, it was the ultimate cruelty. These devs didn't prepare us for what it would mean to feel things like this. These weren't movies that we were passively observing, they were stories we were actively engaged with. A loss was so much more palpable in an experience like this. But on the flip side, actually finishing a game like Final Fantasy II gave us a feeling so much greater than any movie or TV show or book ever could. Beating a JRPG was an achievement. It was a beautiful combination of storyline resolution and personal accomplishment. After a million plot twists, after tunneling underground to meet dwarves and flying to the moon to meet wizards, we were suddenly faced with the most challenging battle of our young lives. And we overcame it. For many of us playing JRPGs in the 90s, that was a high we began chasing right there and then. And even though games have gotten better and better as time has gone on, like objectively better, it's still hard to top the feeling of that first 16-bit JRPG. And that was far from the end of JRPGs on the Super Nintendo. Final Fantasy III came a few years later, of course, and while it was much more sophisticated than 2, I had also gotten a bit older and was perfectly ready for that level of gameplay complexity. The Breath of Fire games were dark and interesting, Earthbound was revolutionary and hilarious, and of course, Chrono Trigger was the greatest thing that had ever happened to video games. If you were a JRPG fan, you really needed a Super NES. But there were other JRPGs in the 16-bit era that existed outside the Nintendo bubble. Back in the 90s, games were pretty much exclusive. A game that came out on all the systems was an extreme rarity. You were fully locked into the ecosystem of whichever game console you owned. If you were a Sega Genesis household, your choices for JRPGs were a bit slimmer, but no less excellent. Phantasy Star was the series you got to hold over the heads of your Super NES friends at school. Phantasy Star was dark, it was sci-fi, it was, in a word, cool. It told its story not with tiny little sprites, but with big, colorful, comic-style artwork. You might even call it manga-esque, but we wouldn't have, because what the heck was manga? Super Nintendo didn't do anything like what Phantasy Star was up to. And there's rarely a conversation about the best 16-bit JRPGs without a mention of Phantasy Star 4. It might have been less played than the Final Fantasies of that era, but it's equally deserving of a place at the table. If you were into complex strategy games, your choices were extremely limited in the 90s, at least in the West. You had Shining Force and Shining Force 2 on the Genesis, Ogre Battle on the Super NES, and that's about it, I think. Shining Force and its sequel were another great reason to own a Genesis in the 90s, though, because there really weren't any other games quite like them. They gave us strategy gameplay, but in a form our young minds could actually comprehend. They served as excellent primers for strategy RPGs to come. Not that they should only be thought of as baby's first strategy games, they're challenging and intriguing in their own right. But they paved the way for the genre to find acceptance in North America, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. Action RPGs were at least a little better represented in the 90s, especially from legendary developer Quintet. If you didn't like turn-based combat but liked interesting stories and characters, Quintet made games for you. Soul Blazer was maybe a little bare bones, but it was an excellent proof of concept for their model of developing, and for telling downright bizarre stories that ignited our young imaginations. Illusion of Gaia came along and blew the previous game out of the water with amazing graphics and music and gameplay that felt so incredibly good. Never knew how much I wanted to bash a monster in the head with a flute, but it's excellent. Not to mention an even more insane story. Quintet's magnum opus was unfortunately kept from North Americans, and it only ever showed up in Europe and Asia. I guess Europe was owed a win at some point, seeing as how they missed so many excellent JRPGs in the 90s, but it still sucks that average JRPG players in North America missed Terranigma. Leaving Quintet behind, Squaresoft proved that they could do much more than just blow our minds with Final Fantasy II. They could also make a killer action RPG. That was Secret of Mana. Holy cow, just the pure joy of playing this game. It's hard to describe. It was the first JRPG I remember playing with someone else, in this case my younger brother. That's right, it was simultaneous co-op. Insanity. It's hard to overstate the impact 16-bit JRPGs had on us in the 90s. It was basically the introduction of an entirely new form of storytelling, and it got us primed for even bigger things to come. Heading into the twilight years of the Super NES, we were blessed with a handful of games that many consider to be still among the greatest JRPGs of all time. I'm talking about the aforementioned Final Fantasy III, Earthbound, and Chrono Trigger. These games came out within a year of each other. Name any other similar period of time that had that big an impact on this genre. Seriously, point out a 1-year period to me down in the comments with at least 3 games that were bigger than these 3. I doubt it can be done. But honestly, I'm open to being proved wrong. These were games that had learned all the lessons of all the JRPGs that had come before them and were thus able to send off the 16-bit era in style. In our minds back then, it was hard to imagine how things could get better. But we'd had thoughts like that before, and things had gotten better. Ridiculously so. And so we were certain there was nothing that could derail this train we were on. Nintendo was home to the best genre ever, and we were on board for whatever they had for us next. If you were a Super NES JRPG fan, one who bled Nintendo Red and subscribed to Nintendo Power, your choice of follow-up console to the Super Nintendo was pretty much made for you. The Nintendo Ultra 64 was the only game in town as far as we were concerned. Squaresoft had exclusively released games for Nintendo consoles. Other developers also only released their JRPGs on Super Nintendo. Why on earth would this next console generation be any different? It turns out JRPG developers had big aspirations, and Nintendo's new 64-bit box just didn't meet their needs. See, Nintendo 64 was a cartridge-based system, just like the Super Nintendo and Nintendo before it. To us Nintendo heads, that made perfect sense. It was the only way to play games. But Sega, and even more so Sony, yeah, the company that made Walkmans, they thought it would be better to put games on CDs. Now, we'd heard of CDs in the 90s. Technically, they've been around for quite some time at that point. But they were for music. Cartridges were for games. For a lot of technical reasons that us 90s kids really didn't understand, though, CDs could hold a lot more game data than cartridges, and that made the format super appealing to a company like Squaresoft, who wanted to make their games as cinematic as possible. See, it wasn't just the players that were affected by their storytelling in the Super Nintendo era, it was them too. They saw how they moved us in Final Fantasy II as we said goodbye to Tella, or in Final Fantasy III as Celeste dramatically leaps from the cliff top, or in Chrono Trigger as we said goodbye to all our friends in the end, and they wanted to hurt us even more. They wanted cutscenes that were fully cinematic, dramatic story beats that were indistinguishable from movies. I'll admit, as a 90s JRPG player, those things didn't matter all that much to me, at least on paper. But looking on with envy at the PlayStation games stuffed with FMV sequences, it did make me a little bit jealous. But some of us held out hope. We knew that the new Zelda game was coming soon, and even though we understood Zelda to be a bit different from games like Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger, it was still close enough to count. And there was also Quest 64. This was the game that promised us a giant 3D world to explore, full of interesting characters and challenging combat, and a story that would finally justify that N64 purchase. I don't know if that game ever actually promised all that, but it was implicit, okay? We all felt it. And we all felt the profound disappointment when Quest 64 turned out to be, well, Quest 64. It didn't fix our problems for us. All we could do as 90s JRPG fans is take the L and pony up for the true successor to the Super Nintendo's JRPG library. Bringing home that PlayStation and a copy of Xenogears felt like stumbling half dead into an oasis in the middle of the Sahara. From the moment that disc spun up and gave me one of the most impressive anime intros I had ever seen, I knew things were about to be different. For those of us JRPG fans who had been led astray by our blind faith in Nintendo, it felt a little strange to be so thoroughly enjoying another console's library, but we got over it eventually. Final Fantasy VII helped. The marketing geniuses at Square were able to convince a heretofore untapped audience to check this out, which grew the fan base and helped secure even more JRPGs to come out in the West in the future. We finally received the full trifecta of Final Fantasies with the PlayStation when Final Fantasy VIII and IX followed 7. 8 was weird and experimental, and 9 was like a comfortable blanket, warm and familiar. I'll let you speculate about which one I prefer. We also finally received a couple of classic Final Fantasies that we missed the first time around, with versions of Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy V finally coming out over here. At the time, playing them, I felt like we hadn't really missed out on much, but I have much more respect for them now as a grown-up. The Breath of Fire series continued with 3 and 4, and we even somehow got a sequel to Chrono Trigger in Chrono Cross, a feat that seems impossible nowadays given how hesitant Square Enix has been to do anything at all with that franchise. We started to see a huge influx of tactical RPGs, with Final Fantasy Tactics leading the way, but there were a ton more. Front Mission 3, Hoshigami Ruining Blue Earth, Tactics Ogre. If you weren't terrible at strategy games like I am, the PlayStation 1 was feeding you good. We also saw what were the first of the elaborate collector's edition packaging that many JRPGs are known for, with the release of Lunar Silver Star Story Complete and Lunar Eternal Blue Complete. Getting games as cool as those in boxes that were full of so much awesome merchandise for what felt like nothing was incredible. There was a lot more experimentation in the PlayStation era, or at least more experimentation that made its way west. The Saga Frontier games were deeply odd in the context of the traditional JRPGs we were used to, and Thousand Arms was a dang dating simulator grafted to an RPG. Vagrant's story innovated in so many ways too, with completely original combat and an art style and presentation that are gorgeous to this day. And also it was way too hard for me. We need an Ivalice Chronicles remaster of that one that maybe has an easy mode for dummies like me. Please. Yeah, with the PlayStation, we were back in it. JRPGs were king again, and our fears that our favorite genre had gone away just vanished. But there was honestly so much more to come. We take it for granted today, but the internet in the 90s wasn't nearly as ubiquitous as it is now. You couldn't be on the internet while someone was on the phone because they used the same line. Unless you were rich and had a dedicated internet phone line, but nobody I knew had that. We were simple folk. Simple folk with big dreams. Dreams of being able to finally learn all about the JRPGs we were missing out on because they never came to the West. I had always known vaguely that there were games released in Japan that never reached us. Some of them I only found out about because Nintendo foolishly previewed them in Nintendo Power. Games like Tales of Phantasia and Star Ocean. These looked like they were going to be some of the most incredible 16-bit JRPG experiences ever, and they got us so hyped for them to come out. And then they never did. At least not for a long, long time, and not on the Super Nintendo. No, if we wanted to play those games in the 90s, we had to resort to sailing the seven seas, flying the black flag, and shivering our timbers. You get what I'm saying. We downloaded ROMs. There were computer programs called emulators that could trick games into thinking your computer was a Super Nintendo, and they were incredible. They opened the door to so many possibilities. And thanks to talented linguists with free time on their hands, a lot of the heavy hitter games we missed out on were blessed with translation patches. These were maybe a bit complicated to set up, at least for me, a certified dum-dum, but once we figured it out, we found ourselves playing Tales of Phantasia at last. And even bigger games than that, the sequel to Secret of Mana we missed out on. It's known as Trials of Mana now, but at the time we knew it as Seiken Densetsu 3. It was deep, complex, it was more mana. We were also finally able to rectify the misdeed of Terranigma not reaching North America and play one of the greatest action RPGs of all time. Like, not just that it was great then, but to this day, it's brilliant. Emulation gave us that chance. Sure, we knew there were vague ethical/legal issues around it, but we were kids, and the internet was still the Wild West. Plus, I think the statute of limitations is long past, so it's probably fine to talk about it now. The internet also gave us the opportunity to pick up merchandise related to our favorite JRPGs. This was mind-blowing. It wasn't just games that Japanese players got, they also got art books, figures, soundtrack CDs. It was insane. Despite being young and not having credit cards of our own, we were somehow able to import some of these things and add them to our collections. Like the Chrono Cross soundtrack. I purchased this long before the game ever hit North America, and I wore all 3 discs down with how often I listened to them. Never before had I been so excited about a game, and having early access to the music made me even more hyped to play it. And there were other CDs I managed to get my hands on too. Arranged CDs, they were called. Xenogears Creed, Final Fantasy IV Celtic Moon, Final Fantasy VI Grand Finale. Beautiful renditions of so many classic songs done up with real instruments. Truly astonishing. And honestly, I think listening to so much of this music helped set me on a path of making music myself. Like, I can draw a straight line between falling in love with Yasunori Mitsuda's soundtracks and my own songwriting. Without the internet to show me what was possible, it wouldn't have happened. The internet gave us news sites, forums, places that showed nothing but the information we were eager to learn. Sites like the Gaming Intelligence Agency and rpgamer.com gave us quick access to up-to-the-minute information about all the games we had to look forward to. We finally got to hear from the game creators themselves too, through interviews and videos. Videos the size of a postage stamp and like 2 pixels by 2 pixels, but still. I know I really began to identify the particular game creators that I respected the most because of sites like these. Hironobu Sakaguchi, Nobuo Uematsu, Yasunori Mitsuda. I could finally put a face and a name to the games that meant so much to me. And along with websites, there were forums where we could finally connect with other people who liked these games too. I don't know how it was for everyone, but for me, I didn't know a single person who was into Final Fantasy or Chrono Trigger. Most everyone I knew played video games, sure, but they preferred games I just had no interest in. My number one hobby was something I could share with no one. But the internet at least gave us a way to start to connect with other people. It's honestly my favorite part of the internet to this day. The 90s were such a formative time to be a gamer. They were extra formative for me since that was when I was a kid, so I was literally forming. but they just did so much to establish gaming as a hobby, and also JRPGs as a viable form of entertainment in the West. If you were gaming during the 90s, I'd love to hear about some of your memories. If you're anywhere near my age, I'm sure you've got quite a few. I do want to point out, I understand that I didn't really talk about handheld gaming. Game Boy obviously had quite a lot of JRPGs, Pokemon being like one of the most obvious, and that came out at the very tail end of the 90s. I really didn't mess around with handheld gaming though. I had a Game Boy, I played Metroid 2, I played Mario Land, but for the most part, I just didn't find it enjoyable, so it wasn't really part of my life, and I felt like if I'm going to talk about that in any kind of poetic way, it would be sort of inauthentic because I didn't really have that experience. But anyway, just throwing that out there so you know I didn't forget, it's just wasn't part of my journey. Anyway, that's all. Just felt like being nostalgic today. Hope you're all having a great week, and I'll see you soon. Bye.